Proud and happy to be partnering with BIC and the Center for Budget and Policy Studies to organize this evening's discussion. We have a panel discussion on an alternative development agenda for India, a book by Sanjay Kaul. We also have a stellar panel bringing together civil servants, academics, and civil society to discuss how we can put people, human lives, at the center of what we call development. First, the author. Sanjay Kaul is a development analyst with experience of being in the IS and experience of being in the corporate sector. He brings 4 decades of experience in both sectors. He's worked in various development sectors, including health, nutrition, education, child development, food, everything that he talks about in the book. And recently, he's also been in the Prime Minister's office. Recently, he was appointed chair of the Government of India Task Force on Early Childhood Care and Education, and I'm happy to say I serve alongside him on that task force as a member. He's also a trustee on the Karnataka Health Promotion Trust, the World Food Programme Trust of India, and closely associated with mobile creches, where he served as its chairperson. In 1998-99, if I may hark back to those old days, he chaired a working group that produced Karnataka's first human development report, and I was on that working group as a very young officer. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sanjay Kaul.
Thank you, Uma. Good evening, and thank you all for being here today. Let me also, like Uma, thank the BIC for hosting this event, and of course, the Karnataka IS Association and the CBPS for supporting today's discussion. I would particularly like to thank Vandita. I'm hoping that she should be able to join us soon, Professor Sriram, Jyotsna, Gurucharan, and of course, Uma for agreeing to be the discussants. My book is dedicated to Anita Kaul, whom several of you have known and worked with, and I hope I have done some justice to her rich legacy. The book, as the title suggests, advocates an alternative approach to public policy on development issues. Now, you may ask, legitimately, why do we need a reordering of priorities and a fresh approach? Why is that required? After all, you could argue that since the liberalization of the 1990s, we've had reasonably good and satisfactory economic growth. And you could even argue that within the fiscal constraints, governments do have a large number of welfare programs for the poor. Yet, while all this is true, you'll also recognize that in society and the country, several disturbing signs have emerged that need a fresh rethink on our development approaches. And it's not only social and civil strife. India has become one of the most unequal of societies across nations in the world, with the bottom 20% continue to be mired in deep poverty. Our economic policies have not provided gainful employment to large sections of the population. Human development indicators like health, education, and nutrition have improved, but you'll agree they do not tell a very flattering story for the country. A significant section of the population, especially in urban towns and cities, reside in conditions that can be best described as unlivable. So this is the context, really. And government are implementing a large number of welfare programs for the poor. However, our analysis, and there is a lot of literature to back what I'm saying, most such programs do not by themselves enhance the productive capacity of households or enable them really to enhance or improve their incomes. My, therefore, hypothesis and the theme of the book is that a clear focus on human development and livelihoods is a better approach than a focus purely on GDP and economic growth, even if it is accompanied by a slew of measures which I call welfarism adopted by successive governments, both in the center and the state. And India has a limited window of perhaps 2 or 3 decades at best before it begins a transition like other countries, middle-income countries, to an aging society. So it is in this context that I strongly argue that the time for course correction is now, and I seek to demonstrate that there is a feasible alternative development agenda that I call the people first agenda, or the people first imperative. The starting point of such an analysis has to address a fundamental question. And we have been civil servants. Why have government policies and programs, even those that were well-intentioned, not provided significantly improved livelihoods and well-being for poor households and jobs for the millions of our educated youth? In my quest for answers, I have been singularly fortunate that I had the privilege of looking at government programs from a dual perspective, as Uma mentioned. First, on the inside as an IS officer, and for many years in Karnataka, where I was fortunate to have worked in several of these sectors. And most recently, I spent close to 15 years in the corporate sector leading an agribusiness company. And of course, through these years, my understanding has been reinforced by discussions with colleagues and friends. And in the last 2-3 years in the writing of the book, by significant amounts of excellent evidence-based scholarly work, both in India and globally, on what works in societies like India and what does not. So in framing this alternate agenda, I've consciously picked 7 intertwined and interconnected sectors that I think matter most to our people: health, education, food and nutrition, child development, gender, livelihoods, jobs, and urbanization. This approach, I believe, makes better sense than the conventional approach of development economists that look at development from the prism of economic sectors of agriculture, industry, services, infrastructure, trade, finance, and monetary policy. So each chapter, therefore, starts with a rather dispassionate diagnosis of the systemic issues plaguing the sector, followed by what I believe are very practical and implementable solutions. In addition, and I think this is what, in my view, sets this book apart from other excellent development policy literature, is that I have viewed these issues from the eyes of a typical impoverished family. In my book, this fictional tribal family, led by Birsa and Rasika and their 3 children, their travails connect the chapters and the narrative. The objective is not limited, really, and that's not the purpose of the book, to critique government policies, but it's rather an attempt to trigger a healthy debate amongst all of us on vital issues to find practical and feasible solutions. In looking at these issues from this lens of Birsa and Rasika, 3-4 premises emerge. First, as we said, our preoccupation with GDP growth does not and has not provided, as we all recognize, Birsa and Rasika, significant improvements in their quality of life. And let's take Karnataka. Karnataka today boasts of the highest GDP growth across all states, and now ranks as high as 3rd in per capita income. But when you look at the Human Development Index, it drops to 11, and it ranks even poorly on education at 14th. So therefore, the second premise is that the conventional argument is amongst not only civil servants and civil society, but amongst people at large, that government mismanagement and corruption is responsible for poor outcomes. And I differ with this analysis. Instead, and this is what I have tried to demonstrate, that it is an inadequate understanding of poor households and inadequate understanding of poverty, and the lack of a full understanding of how government works, which is largely responsible for the systemic flaws that we see in the design of many programs that civil servants like I and my colleagues have over the years designed. Finally, and that was why I talked of urbanization, the book's analysis shows that poor households may not get significantly enhanced incomes through the conventional approach of beating over and over again agriculture and rural traditional households. It is only large-scale planned urbanization that can provide the millions of jobs so urgently required in the country. And there's clear evidence of this in all states. Look at Bangalore. 1/3 of your GDP comes from Bangalore city alone. And if you were to look at other towns and cities in Karnataka, maybe 60 to 70% of GDP comes from our cities. The central theme, therefore, that emerges is that an alternative development agenda sharply focused on people's well-being and livelihoods is not only an urgent imperative, but also that is feasible and fiscally sustainable. And I argue that this is possible within the constraints of government realities and government functioning. So families such as Birsa and Rasika are so caught up in their daily struggles that they often remain unmoved and untouched by even well-intended government programs. We currently have so many and hundreds of programs with, Prasad is here with some of them with minuscule budgets and systemic shortcomings. The book argues that instead, if we had recognized the limited government capacity of implementation and focus only on a few critical, well-designed interventions, that could perhaps have a more visible and tangible impact on people's lives. So in each of these 7 sectors that we've identified, we've tried to raise uncomfortable but basic questions. And to a shortage of time, I will just give you a sample of a couple of these in each sector to give you a flavor of what the book is about. In the health sector, for instance, you ask a fundamental question. Why is the service quality in our primary healthcare system and in government hospitals so poor in contrast to well-run private hospitals? Why is it despite a fairly extensive hospital network and primary health centers across the country, when most poor households, when they fall ill, do not go to a government facility or a government provider, but often to a local untrained health provider? The book challenges the conventional wisdom that India needs to keep on adding even more hospitals and primary health centers. In contrast, the book analysis reveals that a numbers game fixated on targets only diverts meager resources away from the upkeep and staffing of existing facilities, and could even be an obstacle sometimes because it diverts money to what could be strengthening the public health system. Would not, therefore, for instance, improving PHCs and the existing community level and block level hospitals reduce the pressure on district level and tertiary hospitals such as the All India Institutes? After all, most patients coming to the AIMS, we all know, ought to have been handled at a much lower facility. In addition, rather than focusing only on curative care through the hospital system, we argue that a well-designed preventive and promotive healthcare system would reduce the number of people requiring hospitalization in the first place. From health, we move to food insecurity and malnutrition. And there's a huge and apparent paradox. India spends close to 3 crores annually on food security and nutrition, which includes the world's largest public distribution system, the world's largest midday program, and the largest child nutrition program. The highest spent by any country, even in per capita terms. Yet, why do poor households, and especially young children, continue to have the twin problems of calorie energy deficits and huge nutrition balances? And we ask, does poverty alone explain this situation? The book argues that perhaps in some situations, poverty and hunger do not always go hand in hand. The analysis shows that it has been incorrectly assumed that the supply of cereals and nutrition supplements are adequate to tackle malnutrition. As we explore, we need to understand household behavior and then generate a set of workable and cost-effective ways, which is what I have tried to do in my book to improve nutrition outcomes. Then next, the book quickly shifts to education, and we ask, why do government schools perform so poorly? In higher education, after all, government institutions are on par or better than several privately funded counterparts, so why not government schools? We challenge the conventional paradigm that once you open schools, provide teachers, and supply textbooks, the rest will largely take care of itself. We must recognize, and those of us who are present here today must recognize, that a lot of formal learning of our children, studying in private schools, is not taking place in schools, but is taking place at home. And Birsa and Rasika and poor households are unable to provide such a learning environment at home. And that is perhaps one primary reason for poor outcomes in government schools. The book, therefore, tries to identify a set of strategies that are both teacher-friendly, can improve teacher and government school performance, and more critically, support a learning environment for children from poor households like Birsa and Rasika's. Now, these health, nutrition, education are excellent enablers for households to enhance livelihoods, but would be meaningless in the absence of jobs. And where are the jobs? So how does the government create jobs and livelihoods for the millions of our youth and poor households? And within them, how does it provide women to enter the job market in large numbers? Birsa and Rasika are so caught up in a vicious poverty trap as they continuously borrow money and move from one crisis to another. Despite the best of government strategies, it is my firm belief, and I'm hopeful that many of you within the civil service will accept, that there will always remain very limited opportunities in agriculture and in traditional livelihoods. Even several labor-intensive manufacturing industries such as apparel and food products have in recent years witnessed either stagnation or decline in employment. Consequently, graduate unemployment is on the high. Number of self-employed young people have also declined. And the female labor participation rate, work participation rates, of course, are close to as low as 20%. Even more disturbing is that women workers, wherever they work, are mostly engaged as agricultural labor or are employed in the lower end of the value chain in low-skilled and poorly paid jobs. The book's analysis shows that most decent livelihoods and jobs will emerge in towns and cities. With limited opportunities in rural areas, migration to towns and cities may therefore be the first step to changing Birsa and Rasika's economic trajectory. The book identifies multiple blocks for supporting these labor-intensive enterprises, for supporting these migrant labor. While looking at strategies for improving livelihoods, of course, the key focus has been on women's livelihood and on changing mindsets on gender issues. And the final logical question is, when households migrate to towns and cities, where do they live? We are talking not of small numbers, we are talking of maybe as over 50 million households in the next 2 decades, which will be getting into our towns and cities. The living conditions in towns and cities, even for existing poor households, can be best be described as unlivable. And should we therefore continue to live in denial and continue to look for solutions in rural areas? Or do we look at trends globally and begin planning for this large influx that is not only inevitable, but also because most economic growth will come from towns and cities, look at urban settlements. We therefore ask, what can governments do to improve in cities the deplorable state of sanitation and sewage? How can it deal with the near absence of decent low-income housing in our towns and cities? And how can it reduce congestion on our roads? We argue that we look at little counterintuitive proposals here. Bangalore, for instance, the time in the 80s when I was DC Bangalore, had plotted development of everybody being given 30, 40, 40, 60s, 60, 80 sites. And our firm belief is that not only Bangalore, but several other cities like this have therefore this kind of plotted development has created what is now akin to an urban sprawl. So therefore, what would be the option for poor households? Can government, and I believe the government cannot get into the business of providing housing for poor households. So therefore, this business of giving house pattas may be appropriate for rural areas. You don't have the land and the wherewithal and the space. So I advocate a very radical proposal. And this is my private sector mind comes in, of creating a private sector-led low-income housing market to enable migrant and poor households to rent decent housing. Today, if you are willing to pay 15,000, you get a reasonable rent. But if you're wanting to rent a place for 5,000, 7,000, you don't have places. So, for example, let us move from housing to what else labor will require, public transport. And therefore, we ask, is bus transport for households a more cost-effective strategy in comparison to the high capex metro system? And many of you who have had the luxury of using the metro would not agree with me. But please remember that if you look at Bangalore, phase 3 alone is estimated to cost 17,000 crores and would cover 44 kilometers. By just limiting this metro line by 4 kilometers, you could finance not the standard BMTC buses, but 3,000 Volvo buses, which would completely change the landscape of Bangalore's public transport system and ease congestion. And if 1,000 buses of these could be earmarked for women, it may serve women commuters better from a safety and convenience point of view, rather than the free bus travel as the state government has recently announced. Similarly, we ask, should governments continue to yield to the demand from vehicle owners like ours to widen roads and build more and more flyovers that leads to shrinkage of the space for walking, or should it give more priority to pedestrian paths? And I was surprised to know that a city like Bombay, over 55% do not use even trains or cars, they walk to work. And this percentage could be higher in Bangalore with the salubrious climate if the focus were to shift to building good walking pathways rather than costly flyovers and widening of roads. Finally, the development agenda that we set out is an integrated holistic plan, and that's why these sectors are together and integrated. But one final set of questions you will ask me, and even if assuming that some of my proposals make sense, and Mr. Bhattacharya is here, he's been finance commissioner for many years, Prasad is here, the question will be, where is the money? Does this agenda mean pulling out resources from other critical sectors such as defense and infrastructure and from highways? And each government makes a host of promises, as the new Karnataka government has done. The fiscal space will, we must recognize, remain very limited. But the book demonstrates that there are many cost-effective and fiscally sustainable solutions to the issues discussed, and I'll argue that several of them also make for good electoral politics. In the final chapter, we've estimated the amounts required for each of the proposals, and I find that a mere 2% of GDP annually would be adequate to fund the entire alternative development agenda which I proposed. Tax experts are unanimous that the current tax to GDP ratio at 17% is abysmally low, and there is potential to garner an additional 5% to not only fund this development strategy, but also finance other vital areas of the economy. Without compromise on academic rigor, and I hope I've not compromised on that, I've attempted to write the book in a reader-friendly and accessible style, because the idea is to reach a wider audience and not merely limited to economists, social scientists, and professionals. The hypothesis overall is that a caring and responsible polity that ensures the well-being and a decent livelihood of its citizens is not only an aspirational goal, but is eminently achievable. And I hope that this book triggers a healthy debate and discussion. You may not agree with all my solutions, but so long as the discussions emanate, my purpose would have been served. I would, in fact, be very pleased if even a few of these book proposals find a place in the election manifesto of political parties or in policy documents as we head to the 24 elections. I seek your support in this endeavor and eagerly look forward to this discussion, as well as other follow-up discussions, which I hope will follow at multiple forums. Thank you very much again for your presence here today.
Thank you for that excellent overview of what is going to be a very interesting book. Some of us have read it, and we hope our panel discussion will tell you more about the book, but we hope there'll be a lot of interesting questions and difficult questions for the author as well as for other panelists. I'd like to invite our distinguished panel to the stage. First, Vandita Sharma, Chief Secretary, Government of Karnataka. Vandita Sharma is an officer of the 1986 batch of the Karnataka cadre. She has 36 years of experience in administration in sectors such as women and child development, primary education, agriculture, infrastructure development, as well as in Government of India. Thank you, ma'am. Please. Dr. Jyotsna Jha is the director of the Center for Budget and Policy Studies. She has worked extensively on education, health, gender, child development, and governance and accountability, as well as studied budgets in Karnataka. Most recently, she's worked on building an alternate research and outreach framework that will help women working in public spaces to articulate their needs and enable their inclusion. And we hope to hear more about that. Jyotsna Jha also is one of 14 Gulmakai Network champions across the world, selected by the Malala Fund to develop a mentoring program that teaches girls, adolescent girls, critical thinking and how to speak their mind. Thank you. Gurucharan Gollakeri is the Director, School of Social Sciences at the MS Ramaya University of Applied Sciences. He has previously been the Director of the Public Affairs Center He has been a civil servant with a distinguished career in the IAS and in sectors which have included fiscal responsibility, public finance management, accountability, migration, and development. Thank you. Professor M.S. Sriram is a faculty member at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, and currently chair of the Center for Public Policy. He has worked and written extensively and served on high-level committees on the subjects of cooperative banks, licensing small banks, and financial inclusion. He's also a trustee of Pratham Books, I didn't know that, Sanket Trust, which runs Ranga Shankara, and Dastkar Andhra. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today and what we hope will be a very interesting discussion. I also have to mention one more person who's not on the panel today, but to whom the book is dedicated, and that is Vandita Kaul, whom Sanjay already mentioned. Extraordinary civil servant, an extraordinary human being, someone whom all of us were fortunate to know, and who is, in many ways, present with us in the pages of this book, with all her rigor, her intellect, and her many disagreements and very powerful points of view. She was the prime force between transformative interventions like the Nalikali activity-based learning pedagogy and the Right to Education Act. Anita Kaul truly symbolized the philosophy that if you don't care who gets the credit, you can get some amazing things done. In the finest tradition of the civil service, I have to say this, Anita and Sanjay Kaul were very thoughtful and generous mentors. And a whole generation of us, Ravi spoke about the fraternity of the IS, a whole generation of us were very fortunate to benefit from the experience and the warmth of their mentorship. We will now have the formal release of the book by the Chief Secretary of the Government of Karnataka, Vandita Sharma. Request you to do the honors. I'd like to just make a brief comment before we turn to the panelists. As young officers training in the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy of Administration, Sanjay Kaul spoke of a people-first approach, and I thought of this. We were taught about Gandhi's talisman, about how to keep people at the center of everything that we do. And just briefly to share with those who haven't read this beautiful piece of advice from Gandhi, whenever you're in doubt or when the self becomes too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest and weakest man whom you may have seen and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to them. Will he gain anything by it? Will it restore him to control over his own life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to Swaraj for the hungry and spiritually starving millions? Then you'll find your doubts melting away. I'd like to just mention that Birsa and Rasika Oraon, this imagined tribal family from the rural interior part of India, in Jharkhand, have 3 children, Komal, Bindu, and Shibu, aged 8 years, 3 years, and 5 months respectively. This is important because even though they don't exist, they actually exist all around us, and they're in many ways invisible to us every day. They had a 4th child who died as an infant at the age of 3 months. Birsa and Rasika work as wage laborers. Sometimes one of their children misses the Anganwadi. Sometimes the older child misses school because she has to look after the siblings. There's one day, and this stuck to me, it stayed in my mind. There's one day when Rasika, the mother, actually knows vaguely that a vaccination camp is happening in the village. But sometimes Rasika is so trapped in her daily struggles that she does not take the baby for vaccination. And I think this is why it's so important what you talk about, that we need to understand the poor and understand the reasons. We usually look at them as aggregates and files and statistics, but we need to understand them as individual people. M.S. Sriram, I'd like to start with you. As chair of the Center for Public Policy, let's ask you about your key policy takeaways. As we know, as we've discussed, we often say that the best theory is that which succeeds in practice. And so Sanjay Kaul brings a certain pragmatism and a practical approach to public policy. What is your response to the book's analysis of why we have flawed policy design in the first place, and the book's suggestions for how we can improve on them?
The book makes one most significant, interesting point, which is cutting across all the seven themes that Sanjay is talking about, which is basically instead of looking at solutions afresh, let's look at the solutions that are already there and try and make them much more effective. And it's a very interesting paradigm. In fact, if you were to take the example that you've given of higher education, and I represent a government institution which is in higher education and which also sort of hopefully represents excellence and stands as a benchmark for the private sector to come in. I think that's the broad point you make about several sectors, saying that can we make wonderful government institutions and set them up as benchmarks for the market and the private sector to come in. I think that's the most significant point of this book, that's the biggest takeaway for me in terms of the way policy is framed. Because otherwise, usually when we're looking at public policy, we're basically looking at GDP, tax rates, and how do we allocate the resources, and what are the differing sectors that are. So we don't look at how do we partner in. So we also break this into what are public goods and what are essentially state responsibility, and completely leave the private sector out, saying that, okay, here is a policy and that's about it. But we don't look at building bridges and partnering, and I think this opens up that possibility to that partnering. So that's one big takeaway for me in terms of the framework. So it goes beyond just the binaries of the state and the business, and that's something that is important. Second is, it's sort of the last chapter which Sanjay has brought in is actually, he's tried to estimate what it costs. I have not seen many policy books which ultimately end up doing a budgeting of what their recommendations are. So these are the two big takeaways for me. I guess there are, the job of a writer is that of a regulator. He can only anticipate what the readers will do. But the job of a critic is that of a fraudster. He knows what the regulation is out there and then innovate over and above that. So therefore, we'll have cribs on your book saying that these are not there in the book. So obviously, it's a brief book. I guess each one of these chapters could have expanded into double or triple the size to say, to sort of do a alap on the introduction that you've given, because it needs that sort of a engagement. That's a little bit of a disappointment, because given that you were also in the civil services, there is a departmental structure, and it sort of does not look into the governmental structures and how this would fit into the structures. I mean, that would have been useful. That's one bit. I'd just like to make one point about urbanization, which is a very interesting point that you make. There are two aspects. I mean, for a long time, I have not followed the Karnataka government budget in the last 2-3 years in so much of detail, but typically the Karnataka government budget would have one chapter on urbanization or urban development and one chapter on Bangalore city, as if Bangalore was not urban development, so it needed a special focus. What that means is that there is this concept of urban centrality, where people tend to move to one particular city in a given area, and that develops disproportionately, or sort of the migration. So I think the point that you make about urbanization is interesting, but you don't make it as emphatically about decentralized urbanization as it should have been done. It's very important to decongest cities like Bangalore and have many more smaller towns and cities, and that's one, because just urbanization would result in slums, and you've talked about low-cost housing. The second is we don't have a very good framework for social security in urban areas for the poor. If you looked at what happened during the COVID and the reverse migration, that essentially told us that the rural social security network is still working. Whatever is the inadequacy, the urban is not working. That's why they had to move. So these are the 2 points I'd like to make. I'll stop here. I think I took more than...
No, not at all. Thank you. So building bridges, partnering, and that very beautiful metaphor of an alap on public policy, but also the difficulties of living in Bangalore and the need to decongest the city. This is, as Bangaloreans, you've been away from Bangalore too long. So that is one of the other perspectives that we'd like to add. Jyotsna Jha, we know that GDP and even per capita GDP and the singular obsession with these make us miss some of the hidden inequalities, including regional imbalances, gender, caste, disability, and many more. We've also heard a lot of talk about K-shaped recoveries and the ways in which quality of life at the top and the bottom are diverging. We've heard from sources that the informal sector seems to be struggling, real wages seem to be stagnating. What's your response to the focus on human capital in this book, on health, nutrition, food security, education, child development, and livelihoods? Is there space for these themes, fiscal space and also mind space?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Uma, and thank you actually for including me in this discussion. And so at CBPS also happy to be part of the organization of this discussion. And before coming to the book, let me, allow me to remember Anita, because I kept thinking how Anita would have responded, because and how she would have, looked at this, you talked about disagreements, and I also kept imagining about disagreements, and I know that many of you know her, but still I think it's important to talk about it. My first knowing of her started with major disagreements. I was working with the Government of India at that point, supporting, and she was leading the education program here, and so we had major disagreements, which culminated into a friendship which lasted throughout her life. And
that a lot was always how it was with her, I think.
Yeah, and so, such memories of those discussions. And one of those was when she was deeply involved with Nalikali, and I had come here, and it was around 8:39 in her office, and she was still explaining to me when you came to pick her up, and you said that you have to tell her that you have to go, otherwise she won't let you go. She will continue to talk about it. So yeah, she would have, all these would have interested her and engaged her tremendously. And I'm sure she must be very happy with this book coming. One of the things that, when I got the book and started reading, one of the first things that appealed to me was to look at all these sectors together. And I was thinking, I don't know if you agree, that with loss of our 5-year plan, we don't have even a government document, let alone anything else, where we look at different sectors together and in a connected fashion. So everything is very disconnected in last 10 years, all the analysis, good analysis, yet disconnected. And I think that's a major thing that this book does. And recognizing, especially, it's a very divided opinion. People who support public sector and a particular kind of policy, they do only that. And people who oppose that, they do only that. They think everything should be privatized or everything should be public sector based. Again, here, that is broken. And I think that's important. And that's broken not without arguing for that. And private sector comes in, but the public purpose remains, even when he brings the role of private sector. And I thought that was, again, a very important. It's important to recognize private sector, but it's also perhaps more important to recognize the centrality of public purpose, and that comes out. And recognition of all the things that are many a times completely refuted, like poverty, urban poverty, and unemployment, gender. So all that is there. And public health system, public education system. But one thing that one of his solutions that he's talking about, he while talking about the book, he mentioned here that fewer jobs and do it well. But he also, and the government actually, when you go to public sector, and also, public policy researchers and analysts like me who firmly believe in public sector, often meets this wall where you don't talk about people. Not only about citizens, but also people within the government, the public sector. There's a lot about them in this book. The solution lies in having people, skilling them, giving them opportunities, giving them their rights, the social security, not only of the citizens, but also of the providers. And I think that that's extremely important also for the connectedness. The connectedness of the sectors, but also within a sector. And that again, as someone who has worked in these sectors, often sees. For example, you have free medicines scheme, you have free diagnostic scheme, but you don't have technicians. Now, how will that work? So you have all these Anganwadi centers, you don't have Anganwadi workers. You have schools, you don't have teachers. So he does talk of that as a solution for those public service delivery, but also for employment. And for an employment which is respectable, which brings greater equality, gender equality, as well as other forms of equality. And so therefore the connectedness is a very key thing here. And that connectedness also, some of his key solutions, for example, he talks of a single database. All those who are in the government and who follow government closely, like me from outside, know that how parallel databases is one of the most inefficient things. But I think, and that you point out as one major gap, but I think there you could have maybe in your next edition also talk of technology. Whole Aadhaar was initiated with that in mind, but that also has become exclusionary in many ways. And I think while one of the things that philosophy, that it's not only about having a single database, it's also about when you're keeping poor into the center, you also have to think what your major purpose is. For example, like, Dres keeps harping on that, and I think rightly so, that exclusion of one is also a huge issue, even if you're talking of wrongful inclusion of 50 at the cost of that. Now, that change in mindset is also important to point out. So, I think many of the schemes are drafted with poor in mind, but your prime purpose is to, ensure their security, and at the cost of anything else. That I think, and that it's a philosophical thing that, you mentioned Gandhi, that perhaps that is underlying, but I think that can be, brought up front. So that is one. Also, gender, you have a full chapter and you have talked about, how gender matters, and also a lot of issues. Also, many of these, like a lot of government schemes now, technology, and technology is important. We cannot ignore technology in modern times, but not at the cost of exacerbating the, exclusion. And so that, I think, will perhaps bring greater weight. And another thing where I also think that budget is a very good exercise. Not only because it gives you a budget, but to establish that these things are doable. Because often you meet that. The moment you talk of anything, they say it's not doable. So budget exercise is good to prove that it's doable. And you have made even the revenue exercises, you have kind of talked of income tax, you have stopped there and not, but perhaps you had the intention of even suggesting that we can go for wealth tax. And I think that is the kind of inequality we have. We need to talk about it. It's not that wealth tax is a solution everywhere, but the kind of inequality, the growth, you talked about growth, and despite the kind of growth that we have seen, which is fairly, okay, it's not a low growth, even in last 10 years, forget about before that, which was much higher. And still we have jobless, and still we have much higher inequality in this period. That tells us that we need something more drastic, something more direct. And so that I think would. Similarly, I think when it comes to two more things. One is when we talk of gender budget, you also go to gender budget, and I think that's a good thing. So there, apart from the fact that we need more funds and more, directional towards gender equality, also the basic norms of gender equality. No one knows what gender equality is. You could have the entire money being spent on girls' college and the kind of values being internalized which completely defies the concept of gender equality. So I think bringing that having a fundamental, norm that this is a non-negotiable principle. And I think it's perhaps not necessary, but a little reference perhaps to also the political economy of the whole thing and the politics. It's not, and you would know it much more, all of you, than us, than how politics come in. It's not that we decide to go for privatization. There are things that forces you to go for certain choices. So, but little bit of political economy, I think, would further be good. And yeah, so that's it. And congratulations for bringing such a good.
Thank you, Jyotsna, for that beautiful memory of Anita Kaul, and also for pointing out how the book brings a connectedness and a holistic approach to areas which has been missing. It's only when you mentioned it that I realized this is something one has missed for some time now. This approach where everything we're doing has some connection and it has a larger purpose. And that brings me to this beautiful idea of the centrality of public purpose, which is again something that we're at risk of forgetting. Also, I love that about the necessity to look after the social security and the welfare of our own people, our street-level bureaucrats, our frontline workers. And that's something that's so important because that's not just something we need to do morally, but it also makes sense. In a different, maybe 20 years ago, I would have said that the other way. I would have said that morally is the more important thing. But I think it's also economic sense because they'll perform better, their productivity will be better. I think, yes, I would love to hear, and maybe in a different edition, a later edition, your views on technology, because it's now time to look at technology and what it does, because when we're talking about the poor, we always actually use this metaphor of the last mile, which is from telecommunication, but we should be talking about the first mile. And I keep saying that, especially about panchayats, which you haven't mentioned in your book. We'll talk about that later. But exclusion of one versus the inclusion, wrongful inclusion of 50. Exclusion of one should really mean something to us. It should mean that, this is something that's not right, and we should think about it. And yes, thank you for those interventions, Jyotsna. Gurucharan, I know you have some points to make about political economy, and I'm looking forward to hearing you on that. But this is also a book that proposes large-scale planned urbanization as the inevitable way forward. We've already seen, and it was briefly mentioned, vividly during the COVID pandemic, how people coming to Bangalore from distant states and remote interior districts, including people who work in our houses, my home, are part of the city's workforce and its human foundation, but they're often invisible to policy, invisible to us. 30 years after the 74th Amendment, shouldn't we be asking ourselves, why there are still gaps in continuity of public services, health, nutrition, early childhood care and development, school education? Where are these in our cities?
Thank you, Uma. I enjoyed reading the book, so let me congratulate you, Sanjay, on an extremely well-written book. I would also recommend that those who are interested in public policy, in governance, and all the challenges that India is going to face, read this book. It's very eclectic, it's well-researched, and easy to read. So there's little that I would disagree with. But if I had to disagree with something, I would say that you could have touched it with a little bit of optimism, because it reads as if in the last 75 years, India has done precious little. But that's a very small point. I want to make a few points to add to what Sanjay has already presented. I'm not going to deal much with what the book says. I'm sure most of you will read it. Sanjay has already presented what the book contains. But suffice to say that the clarity of the train of thought that he runs through the book is in the preface and in the last chapter, where the preface, he points to three things. One is, he says, I'm adopting a people's first approach. Second is, he says, I'm focusing on 30%, bottom 30% of the population. And I'm trying to bring together 7 key areas that constitute human development challenges. With that said, when I was reading the book, I was left wondering with the question that he asks at the end of the book. So I'll begin with that. So Sanjay asks the question, and Jyotsna mentioned political economy and the political environment. And I quote, what are the chances that the government would adopt the proposals in this book? We had noted in chapter 1 that if the proposals do not have political resonance, then they would remain only confined to academic discourse. And during his presentation, he hoped that this would not be the case and that some political parties or some manifestos might contain some of the recommendations. So I'm going to speak on 3 or 4 key issues that I think will attempt to answer Sanjay's question. Yeah. One is, I think, there is in the development process what in economics would be called the time inconsistency problem. Politicians and elected representatives are interested only in securing the next election, not in securing the next generation. And Sanjay's book actually tries to talk about how we are going to secure the next generation. Now, I just want to give 2 examples from Karnataka, recent examples. Before the elections, the government of the time announced the setting up of a pay commission. Good, that's a good decision. It was timely, maybe it was necessary. And then, even before the pay commission could give its recommendations, and the chair of the pay commission is here in the audience, the government went ahead and announced a 14% or whatever pay increase. CS is here, 17%. And this was despite the best efforts of the Chief Secretary, of the Additional Chief Secretary Finance, and everybody else putting their weight behind preventing this. And then, to make matters worse, the Congress in its manifesto announces 5 freebies or 5 guarantees. Now, the Chief Secretary is suddenly grappling with the problem, especially since ISN is going to retire, perhaps timely retire in June, how this is going to be financed. It's going to be about 50,000 crores if they actually honor those commitments. That would be roughly, if, I don't know the numbers really, but assuming that revenues are about 2 lakh crores, 2 lakh crores, that's going to account for 25% of Karnataka's revenues. So one is the time inconsistency problem. So it's unlikely that all of these things. So if you want to know why in 75 years, Uma's question about why there are gaps, it's probably one reason is the time inconsistency problem. Second is the political economy of development. Innocent as he is, as he has always been in the service, Sanjay Kaul's innocence continues through the book, where he assumes that good things will be done by good people and that good economics will be also good politics. But that's not quite so. The political economy of development will tell you that elected governments are not ideologically agnostic. They represent each party or each group of elected representatives represent class interests of a particular kind. and will not allow any reforms that affect their interests. Case in point, the 3 farm laws, which were very good reform moves for the agriculture sector, but were resisted. And Sanjay deals with not so much the farm laws, but the question of the MSP, the procurement, and the savings that can ensue from how we might more efficiently deal with public distribution and food security. The third, and I come to the question that Uma asked, he also deals with migration, urbanization, and how during COVID, migrant labor faced the most severe consequences of the pandemic. See, we live in an age when the movement of goods and services across borders is considered a virtue. So you want goods and services, you want the best clothing from Delhi or Ludhiana or Tirupur, you want to send your product from here. But if people move, it is seen as a problem, as problematic. Now, as far as migration is concerned, during the pandemic years, 2 or 3 years, and I think Karnataka was one of the states which did an excellent job of handling the pandemic. I know for a fact that all of the people in the COVID war room, as also Chief Secretary's office, and Vandita was Development Commissioner at the time, ISN was in finance, and they did a great job of handling the migrant issue without the kind of consequences that we saw in some of the other states. In part, this was because in Karnataka, you have at least a rudimentary data management system. But the big missing gap in migration is that no state has either a data management system for tracking migrants, and B, no state has a governance architecture to mainstream migrant management into development discourse. Now, you must also remember that when you talk of migrants, the idea of India as a common market is, in my view, is seriously challenged. I mean, just a few weeks ago or months ago, during the election rally time, there was a big brouhaha about Amul coming into Karnataka, right? So in Maharashtra, there is the Marathi Manus. In Kerala, there is the Malayali. In Punjab, there is the Punjabi. So India is really a country in search of an Indian, because you don't want anybody to move freely and you don't want to provide for. So the second problem of migration is, besides the absence of data, which blindsides governments in dealing with the problem, the second problem is that we have not provided for the portability of benefits. See, regardless of where I am, if I am a worker, if I'm entitled to, and rights-based entitlements like food, medical care, I should be able to access it regardless of which geography I am in. And if I have a card, that should be valid everywhere. But that is not the case, right? So that's the other problem for the gaps arising in healthcare, et cetera, that you spoke of. The third thing I would like to say is, Sanjay speaks of a people-first approach. And I want to read what he says specifically on this point. And I quote, "Finally, a people's first agenda must have the people at the center stage. This can be best achieved by involving them in decision-making, empowering local communities, and collaborating actively with grassroots level civil society organizations." Excellent. Now, I would just add that this is an imperative that we cannot run away from. But let's ask ourselves, what greater people's first approach can you have than the 73rd and 74th amendments? I mean, by a constitutional amendment, you have empowered local self-governments, rural and urban, right? Now, if it is that we have failed, despite the constitutional amendments, to empower them, then this is not a problem that's going to go away just because we wish it away, because there is a structural problem there. And what is that structural problem? if you really look at urban local bodies in Karnataka or in India, Karnataka is much better, I might add, not because I am from the Karnataka cadre, but because Karnataka is really much better. And I'll respond to an important point that Sanjay made in his opening statement, where he pointed out that Karnataka drops to 13, 14 places in equity and so on. I'll come back to that. But the structural problem on urbanization, as well as rural local bodies, in terms of empowering them in a people-first approach, is a financial sustainability problem. You see, we have reduced our urban local bodies and rural local bodies into subalterns of the state, whereas they were supposed to be the third tier of governance. Why did this happen? So by the Schedule 7, we transferred some 28 subjects or 29 subjects to rural local bodies and to urban local bodies. But we have not given them any original sources of revenues, except property tax. There is then some minor sources of revenue, which means really that rural local bodies and urban local bodies are almost entirely dependent on government grants. Okay, and when you are dependent on government grants, the MLAs and the ministers begin to control these local bodies. So unless we actually amend through a constitutional amendment the financial sharing, revenue sharing scheme by which we empower, first of all, I believe that states need to get more share of the revenues. And the rural and urban local bodies should get a much larger share of the revenues. Unless you address those, it's unlikely that urbanization and people's first policies will happen. So, assuming that we do get this revenue sharing arrangement amended, though there's a big elephant in the room approaching, if the delimitation of the Lok Sabha happens, when it does happen very soon, it's going to be working entirely against the southern states, because it's going to alter the political alignment where all decision makers, the lawmakers, are mostly going to be from the north. As it is, and ISN is somewhere here, I saw him, if we pay 1 rupee as taxes to the central kitty, we're getting, I don't know, 16 paise, 20 paise, or something like that. How much does UP get? Probably 1 rupee 20 paise or 1 rupee 30 paise. So, there's already a serious asymmetry, and that's only going to worsen. I'll end by making one last point, and that is, in any theory of change, and I believe that Sanjay's book represents a very strong articulation of a theory of change. Any theory of change is predicated on the hopes and aspirations of individuals, not so much communities. You can give the best PHC, the best network of hospitals, but if there is no agency, individual agency, you can't get that person to seek good health behavior. Seeking good health behavior is not something that is taught. It's a function of the agency of the individual. And I think if you look at Karnataka, and I end with this, after the Dr. Nanjundappa committee report came, and he categorized, and it was a superb report, because it was for the very first time that somebody had actually done some analysis of data and given a numerical or mathematical analysis or an index by which you could measure backwardness. So he classified them as most backward, more backward, and backward. Over the last 20 odd years, I don't know, I guess something like 35,000 crores, 40,000 crores has been spent. And if you see the expenditure, the breakup of the disaggregated, you'll find much of the expenditure has been on buildings, concrete, and brick and mortar work. How much have we spent in the last 20 years on building community agency, or individual agency, in terms of making them not respond as mere beneficiaries of development programs, but actually as participants of the development process, and being able to actually call to account, hold to account the state? Very little. I'm glad that Uma is now in Panchayat Raj actually trying to do that. And one fundamental thing that she's trying to do is to say that, listen, a lot of these line departments, health, all the 7 departments that you speak of, the first mile functionaries, and I've turned the pyramid on its head, the first mile functionaries should be brought under the control of the panchayats. Otherwise, this change is not going to happen. I'll stop here. Congratulations, Sanjay, on an excellent book. I do hope that people, political parties, there's a new government, maybe you can petition the Chief Secretary to get some of these, these included into the... But thank you.
Thank you for some really insightful comments. I've made a few notes. The importance of securing the next generation while people are looking to the short term. You asked some very direct questions about the political economy of development. You talked about India as a country in search of an Indian. That's something to think about. You talked about the need for a governance architecture to mainstream migrants into development discourse, and that's really something that states which are destination states for migration, where we don't have the old bonded labor of the old, shackles on their feet kind of thing, but they're still struggling and they're still exploited and they're still working exploitatively in exploitative conditions, and we need to really think about mainstreaming this into development discourse. And local bodies as subalterns of the state, I don't disagree. You ended with the centrality of individual agency. Thank you. Before I come to Vandita Sharma with a request to sum up and pull it all together, I will request Sanjay Kaul to respond to some of the questions that the panelists have actually raised, and then we can come to the summing up, I think.
I think a lot of the comments made are very relevant, and I agree with all of them. So there were only 2 constraints. And I have a twin who spent 35 years in the publishing business. And he told me, and he retired as MD of the Oxford University Press, he told me, don't make the book more than 80,000 words. So that answers, because people will not read anything more than that. So as you notice, it's a rather slim book. Not because I wanted to make it slim. In fact, before it went to the editor, it was about 50% bigger. Then she and I had to sit and debate on what can be thrown out and what can be retained. That doesn't justify that it should not have delineated or fleshed out some of the proposals. So I completely agree with Sriram that some of it is too sketchy and too much of an outline to really make sense. But before I respond, there's been a lot of discussion on political economy, but I do give a hint of what becomes a good scheme. And you look at AAP's initiative on school education. Actually, it was a coincidence. If you go to the AAP manifesto, they wanted 1,000 new schools. It was just that because they had a difference in the center that the DDA refused to allot them any land. Perforce, therefore, they had to go to the existing schools. And they were able to create a new image or a brand of the existing government schools. And now it's politically become very popular to talk of rebranding and reimagining schools. So I think the challenge for civil servants is how can you do the messaging that the political manifesto becomes not a freebie, but something which is... So the same thing could happen to a hospital. How can you have a Manipal hospital from a Sarkari hospital? So I think the challenge of the civil servant is to put himself not only in the shoes of Birsa and Rasika, but also the shoes of the elected MLA. And I think that should have been the focus of my book, of how we can do that. And I think I failed in not addressing that issue, though I have said that it could be electric. So I've said a Volvo bus could have become as big a brand as a Delhi Metro. And it's depending on how we do the messaging. And I think the challenge of not only civil servants, but policymakers is to recognize the political reality. And I think what Gurucharan says is very right, that if you really want change to take place, you must put yourself in the shoes of the elected representatives.
Or you should also look for opportunities to push small
Yeah,
little
absolutely.
progressive windows of opportunity, as we say. But I'm sure Jyotsna and I will discuss with you later this evening about the Delhi schools, because we're looking at each other and we're dying to roll our eyes about and talk to you about that, but we'll take you to a corner and discuss that. I'll now turn to Vandita Sharma, Chief Secretary of the Government of Karnataka. You have worked in the major sectors, child development, gender, education. You're a strong woman leader. And recently, as Development Commissioner, you were actually handling all these sectors. Can I request you to pull this discussion together and sum up the main points that were discussed, and maybe throw some light on what you think should be the way forward?
Thank you. And I would like to thank for getting this great opportunity to be here, though I feel that it's a little embarrassing. Probably I'm the junior most here. I can see in the audience and here all my esteemed seniors who have been in the same space, who have contributed immensely, who have fought their wars in this Kurukshetra. Well, I don't think I have anything much to say to all of you, because there's a lot of experience in this hall. But I have to, just wanted to comment, have a couple of comments on whatever I could read in the book, and I would confess that I've not read the entire book, but I have been able to go through some portions of it. One is, yes, I really appreciate the unique experience that you have, Sanjay sir, and I am going to call you sir because I am a bureaucrat. Okay? Because of that, and Anita ma'am also used to tell me, never call me ma'am, and I used to call her ma'am, because that is ingrained in us now. So one is that, yes, the uniqueness of your experience is unparalleled because you have been in the Kurukshetra with us, and you have stepped out and watched it from outside and also have that experience. So yes, I could see a couple of things which I would mention, which I think also from government's point of view, we really need to imbibe. One sentence which in the preface itself, which I wanted to read out, the fundamental tenet that sustained economic development cannot take place without addressing human development and livelihood issues. I think that is the theme that runs through this book, from whatever I could gather. And probably that is a theme that actually even in the government it is there. That is the theme on which the government is actually based. However, when it comes to the implementation side, we fail quite a bit. And there are many reasons, and I don't need to mention that because everybody here knows those reasons. There is a lot of, we do try to do a fair amount of focused approach, but it doesn't happen many times. It will happen in pilots. When you start expanding, it sort of dilutes and the quality comes down. So the most important thing which I feel, which is, it's not just a lack of intention in the government or even in the political side. So they may have their political objectives, but yes, some of those aims and objectives can definitely be harnessed to bring about human development. But what happens is ultimately, I feel that at the implementation stage, one, there is a fair amount of dilution, the butter is spread a lot, plus there is an issue of mindsets of our own people. We have to ensure that each and every one of the delivery mechanism person has the same objective. We have not done that. We make some broad schemes and we implement them and we say this is what you have to do, and the parameters on which they are measured are very quantitative. One is the focus on quality, which I agree is missing, and we really need to bring that focus. Apart from the focus on measurement of quality, we also need to ensure that the implementers are equally committed and dedicated. When it comes to pilots, many of the pilots we see, pilot projects, I can mention Uma's own examples. I mean, your Swachh Bharat mission examples, where she has brought in a very good change, which is a beginning with women who are driving garbage collection tippers in the rural areas. And how we will be able to spread that and how we make that into a movement across the state would require an equal amount of qualitative buy-in by each and every Gram Panchayati PDO there. So we need to work right at the grassroots level implementer. That is one thing which I think is missing, that kind of commitment, that kind of ensuring the fact that I will be able to reach the scheme to the poorest of the poor. That's one thing. The second thing which really, and it touched my heart, sir, I would say, is the fact, the focus that is there on the human development side. We definitely measure our growth in economic terms, and we keep tom-tomming about that. And you have mentioned that per capita income is so high in Karnataka, but the human indices are so poor. And Karnataka is one of the best states in the country. So what is it that is lacking there? So the focus on what you call people-first approach. Actually, I would like to go a little further, and you have in your book gone a little further. It's not just people-first approach, it is each person approach, each person as people in our society. If we as civil servants can look at, and the government, I'm not talking of the topmost civil service, I'm talking of every single bureaucrat in this state and country, if we can imbibe the fact, the objective that we join this work is to ensure that that person gets the qualitative input which the government intends to give. I'm sure our job is done, and this happens in many cases, but it's very, very individual-centric. And we mentioned about Anita Kaul, ma'am. She could bring about not only a small pilot-level change. I mean, Nalikali was a huge thing. And it is still there, but we have not taken it forward because, again, that kind of commitment is not there anymore, or it has to be taken forward with a very intense dedication. So, but she brought RTE. So there are ways of, you can say, you can make this a little more formalized and permanent in the system also. The system has to start imbibing the qualitative aspect of our interventions. And it has to percolate down to each and every individual who is within the delivery mechanism. This is something which is our responsibility, and it has to be. We have been struggling. Every person sitting here, I can see many of my illustrious seniors who have done this. We find that we have been trying, and it's an endless struggle. It's going to go on. And that is one issue. And there was something else which came to my mind, but now I am not able to. That was the private participation. That is a very, very important thing. Karnataka has been actually a pioneer in many private initiatives where we participate. One of the examples, I don't know whether KHPT is here today, Spurti. Mohan is here? Okay, so Spurti is such a wonderful program that KHPT did in small district, in Koppal, in a taluka, and now Karnataka has taken it over. The government itself wants to do that kind of an intervention, and if we can retain, now the challenge here will be not just doing it the way KHPT did it in Koppal, but the challenge is in retaining the same amount of quality and the same amount of intensiveness with which it was done in that. So we need, ultimately, I think it boils down to the kind of delivery people we have. So whether it is private, whether it is public, together I'm sure we can make a difference. And the focus on private partnership, I must confess, is reducing. That's the change I have seen in the last few years or decades of my service. There was initially, I used to see much more positiveness towards private initiatives, and now I find that's not happening so much. So at my level, I keep telling all the younger people who join that please give them a lot of respect and bring them into the interventions, because ultimately it's not just us alone who can make a difference. So these are the only 2 points which I wanted to mention. Otherwise, it's a great initiative, sir. Thank you very much, and congratulations on a very well brought out book. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's such a beautiful and optimistic note on which to wrap up this lovely panel. You spoke about the idealism and the principles and the good intentions that actually are the starting point for a lot of our policies. But also the problem that when we need to take it down to the grassroots for implementation, we face challenges in getting buy-in at all levels. We face challenges in terms of incentives, recognition, intrinsic motivation, how to motivate and how to orient our teams, our entire large, huge governmental teams, to look at every person, to see every person where they are. And you gave that very beautiful call to take forward the people-first approach to a person, every person approach, which I think is very beautiful.
Take
Yeah,
advantage
Srinivas.
of being closer to the mic. The question is for you, sir, Gurucharan, sir. Why are we failing in getting the state finance commissions functional? You talked about revenue sharing and empowering rural and urban local bodies, but we already have a legal mechanism for a statutory mechanism for it with the state finance commissions. Last I checked, other than a couple of states, perhaps Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal, no one else is actually taking state finance commissions seriously, and that seems to disempower the urban and rural local bodies. Thank you.
Well, actually, some states have been very regular in constituting the SFCs, but that's not going to solve the problem. What I was trying to say was that unless you amend the Income Tax Act and enable a portion of the income tax to go to the local bodies, unless you amend the GST Act and enable the small share to go to the local bodies, it's not going to be possible to sustain finances of local bodies, at least not in the manner in which we envisage urbanization to take place. You know, the revenue constraints that the state faces itself are significant, but the revenue constraints that local bodies face are enormous. I mean, in most municipalities, besides the shortage of people, they hardly have any money. Besides paying salaries, they're able to do precious little. So regardless of whether a state finance commission is constituted, what it does is it gives them some grants. It's important to empower them fiscally. If you've given them responsibility on development, you must also empower them fiscally to finance that development. That's the point I was trying to make.
Yes, Vinod?
Vinod Vyasulu, I used to teach economics. I've not read the book. All I've seen is what's on the table outside. So the privilege of a stupid question. I heard all that you said, but is any of this at all feasible? If not, how to make it feasible when you have abominations like Bangalore city minister? That's one. The second is a minor comment. Gurucharan talked about panchayats, local self-government, and so on. I just wonder, we use the term even in the constitutional amendment of institutions of local self-governance. I wondered why self-governance. After independence, we don't have the self-government of India. That word self is a bit of a... And then I found that it was a thing used in 1907 in the Royal Commission on Decentralization, when the single one-man all-powerful collector was having difficulty controlling the natives. And they thought local self-government nominated by the collector with powers to override its decisions, with a membership consisting of the local landlord, money lender, gunda, etc. So why is it that that phrase from 1907 has crept into the constitutional amendment?
You know, I'm not sure if you're correct on facts. Raghu is somewhere here. He's the expert on Panchayat Raj, and maybe Uma can answer it, but I don't think they use the term local self-government. They call it urban local bodies and Raghu, am I there?
Institute local self-governance. The self is very important.
But Guru, I'd like to respond to Vinod. I need to respond to the feasibility of doing this. So, you see, I'm sure that you will read the book. There are several recommendations which are politically popular already. And and there's certain things which by design we do not do. And we talked about not excluding a single person. For instance, why is the vaccination coverage only 62%? Has any politician told you that you cannot go to that home a second time and a third time? No. Will it cost so much money? It will not. So the polio immunization, because there was a mission that not a single child would be left over. Why is it not happening to the child? So there are several such suggestions. Availability of a lab technician. Has a politician told you not to create positions of lab technicians when you create a hospital? It is not. He has not said so. So I am therefore not so pessimistic. I'm just saying that if we see through each sector and see through what our target group is, a lot of things are politically feasible. And in my own experience, I found that there were several recommendations which had a political color and a political popularity. Not all of it can happen. I'll wait for you to. I hope you're not disappearing, Vinod.
My name is Priyank. I am doctoral candidate at Center for Policy Studies, IIT Bombay, and I teach public policy at Christ University here. So my question is rather general since the event is also sponsored by Karnataka IAS Association. So why bureaucrats write this book after retirement only? Why do they not give time to researchers like us during their tenure so that we get data and are able to write papers and generate insights? So their knowledge would be more timely if there's this big excess problem in India. Bureaucrats don't give time for interviews, etc. So that is one question. Second question is on that why bureaucrats only talk to economists when it comes to, why do they consider only economists as public policy academicians? They are sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, and now there are so many public policy schools. So I think that attitude is problematic, that economists only generally are considered as public policy scholars. So that is, and supplementary to that is that why only quantitative data is considered as evidence. Now there's so many sort of very well established qualitative research practices, and the insights which are generated from the field, they are also very important. So why the qualitative researchers are not given seat on the table? So those are the two questions. And third, a small comment on the political. Very, very small. I think it is important to make. So I think Sir made this point that parties have ideologies, so do the bureaucrats. And why does the revolving door always opens in the Harvard and McKinsey? Why does it not open in an Anganwadi center? So maybe after 10, 15 years of service, a senior bureaucrat may think about working at least for a week or 2 weeks as an Anganwadi worker. So, I mean, that kind of thing is there. So I think that ideology is there. The bureaucrats are also not ideology agnostic. So it's not just political parties. Thank you.
Do you want to respond to the other thing about? Right. Thanks for that. We'll have two more questions. The last two questions. Yes, Akash.
Hi, I'm Akash. I'm a doctoral candidate in anthropology, actually, at Toronto. Two quick questions. One was to Gurucharan sir's points about sort of looking at sort of the fiscal arrangement. So I wanted to know if there is some thinking required in terms of how the centrally sponsored schemes work, because grievances around how the centrally sponsored schemes constrain state governments have come up quite a bit. And second question, very quickly for the author, perhaps it's too big, but does the book look at sort of the specter of climate change that's haunting us? Most scientists are quite clear. They've been clear since 1990, but now we are quite clear that we probably don't have an Earth. I don't want to be a doomsday sayer, but that's
I'll
the
just
reality.
respond to your last thing. And that also answers some of, so when you write a book, you are constrained not only by the thing, but also how much you can cover. And my whole theme is that you cannot cover everything. So I have picked 7 sectors. It does not mean decentralization in Panchayati Raj is not critical to good governance. It does not mean that technology is not good. It does not mean that, that climate change is not relevant. It does not mean, for instance, that the caste issue and the social fissures and inclusion of minorities should not have been part of the book. So these are very good feedback. But when you make a selection, you make a selection of where you feel you can contribute most. And it does not mean that discourses which cover other aspects are not critical or vital.
The last question.
Hi, I'm Ria. I studied development economics in the US and have returned to hopefully contribute to India's development. It seems like the IIS community is a close-knit community that learns from each other. But then I did hear about silos in the sectors that you spoke about. If it is such a close-knit community, one, why doesn't the IIS community collaborate as bureaucrats in their policies? And then second, in terms of PPPs, there are obviously diverging conceptions. You can talk about corruption and all of that, but when you spoke about not having sound data centers, a single data center, why don't we look at PPPs? We have amazing IT companies that could help contribute and make data not only accessible to the government, but also to the public.
Very valid criticism.
Okay, just about the data bit, I want to mention. Today, government has a lot of data. I can just mention about Karnataka alone, because naturally, I live here, breathe here, everything. Karnataka has data today for 90% of its population. We have a new Kutumba. We call it Kutumba. Okay? The name is very nice. It's a beautiful name. So data is not, it's not the dearth of data. It's how we use it further. That is something which we really need to have, to work on. And silos, you mentioned, that I agree. There is a lot of silos within the government, but I must confess, or I must say happily, that it is now breaking. It's not that, a lot of us, we get together and we discuss across the sectors what are the interventions that have to be brought about and how do you analyze the data that is available with us. And also jointly what is it that we can do. There used to be earlier a lot of duplication. If somebody is doing the same, 2 people in the government will be doing the same thing. We don't even know about it. Today things have changed quite a bit. So it's not that data. You're most welcome to come. We'll showcase to you. Nice to see a young, bright lady like you asking that question. So please do come. We'll showcase what all is available. Government is very rich, actually, in its data. And we'd love to share.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'll just add to that by saying that, COVID, the pandemic and the experience of working together across different departments, across different domains really taught us a whole lot. And one of the things it taught, and we're beginning to realize and we're beginning to learn that lesson, is that we need to work together, not only within the government, but also across sectors. We had the private sector, we had the civil society organization, we had the state coming together. As the pandemic was an unprecedented disaster, so also was the response. It was unprecedented and we all learned to work together. In fact, to the gentleman who asked about research and why we talk only to economists, we don't actually. There was interesting research done by other researchers in the US and in India who worked on work that was happening on MG and Rega during the COVID pandemic and found, in fact, Biju Rao is going to present this on Tuesday when I'm in conversation with him along with T.R. Raghunandan. We found that in panchayats which had elected bodies, as opposed to panchayats which had official administrators, there was a generation of 15% more person days in MG and Rega. So So that's the added value of democracy, which is what Biju calls it. So we do have a bunch of different researchers working with us, and we're always happy. Our doors are open. Please do contact us. Just a word. Let me thank the panelists, Vandita Sharma, Jyotsna Jha, MS Sriram, Gurucharan Golakeri, and our author, Sanjay Kaul. I'd like to thank Ravi and the team at BIC. I'd like to thank the IS Association colleagues. I'd like to thank CBPS for joining us on this. I'd like to thank this lovely audience for spending this evening with us and some terrific questions. Thank you so much.